To me, Palestine was the very first entry point to any sort of activism in life. My first meeting with politics, or what it means to understand the politics behind our identities and where we come from, and therefore the activism that comes with it and the resistance that comes with it. Historically, Palestine, I think, has meant that to a lot of youth in the Arab world. I think especially our generation and the one before it.
Welcome to a new episode of Takes Thyme, the Womena podcast.
In this episode, we're going to talk about Palestine. We're going to talk about what Palestine means to us as individuals, as a media company, and Palestine as an example of something that really showed us the importance of storytelling that's authentic, that's nuanced, that's contextualized in a true and accurate way, and why regional and independent media companies are really, really important, especially at times like this, and how things have changed in social media, in our content creation, and for us as individuals as well.
Yeah, we have a very unique way of approaching crises and current events. At Womena, we don't really do current events. We tend to do broader storytelling that's very focused on the individuals. And when something of this caliber happens to our community, it's very important for us to address it. But we're not a news network. So how do we address it? And I think I'm very proud of the way that we've kind of developed the playbook for talking about these things. It's very Womena, and it's very much driven by your experience in the journalism, current affairs space.
Yeah, I think it's something we definitely developed over time. It's not an area that we used to cover. Like you said, we're not a news organization. We don't usually do political content that's outrightly political. Mm-hmm. A lot of the content we do has political elements to it because of the interconnectedness of things. And
it's about women. So anything about women now is political.
Yes.
All of a sudden.
As the algorithms would also have you believe. When things like this happen in the region, we feel a need, of course, to address it and to amplify further voices than the ones we usually talk to, but also very much from the perspective of the community that's affected and making sure that we get people who know what they're talking about. This is really, really important. We cannot assume that we can understand the experience of someone that's going through something like this. So it needs to be someone that's directly affected by it. And those are the voices that we seek. Mm-hmm. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So if we can go back to just a basic question of what does Palestine mean to us as individuals? What does Palestine mean to you, in your life, in your identity?
I think heartbreak is probably the first thing that comes to mind. It's been such a core issue since I was a little kid. I mean, it's a topic of conversation that has very much dictated most political dialogue in the Arab world and around, the family table. In my family especially, we're very politically conscious. For most of my life, it's a conflict that has continued to arise, and one that I think to a lot of younger people seems like it should be so simple. And yet, it just keeps going. The pain keeps getting worse. And now in the day and age of social media and this interconnectedness, for me, Palestine to me is both this beautiful cultural homeland, rich with so much to share and to give to the world. But at the same time, the lessons that we're learning are so heartbreaking. And I feel like the basic understanding of humanity that's needed when talking about a subject like Palestine or looking at a travesty like what's going on should be very normal. It should be easy to tap into that humanity. And it's so frustrating to see how people want to complicate it. They want to push beyond the simplicity of recognizing the humanity in others, and make it about politics or land or religion or whatever. Realistically, for me, it's as simple as recognizing humans and basic humanity in others. What is it to you?
To me, Palestine was the very first like entry point to any sort of activism in life. And my first kind of meeting with like politics, or what it means to understand the politics of behind our identities and where we come from, and therefore like the activism that comes with it and the resistance that comes with it, and the need for resistance and for understanding the complexities of things. Historically, Palestine, I think, has meant that to a lot of youth in the Arab world. I think especially our generation and the one before it, there were moments when there were things happening in Palestine, like the uprisings, the intifadas, the early 2000s, where it was, for a lot of us, it was the first time we felt the need and mobilized to protest. So played a key role in my life in that way, and I could see it in the community around me and my peers as well. For my family, Palestine, from the perspective of being Egyptian, I mean, my father fought in several of the wars that Egypt entered into.
For real? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Wow.
Talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my father was in a conscript, because in Egypt you get drafted to the army after you finish university. And so, like, at the time, it just so happened at the time that he went into the army to do his like regular 1 year service, it ended up being like a 7 or 8 year stint. And the last of those was the 1973 war with Israel, when there was an invasion of Sinai, and along with the occupation of Palestine and Syria, parts of Syria and Lebanon as well. And so when Israel was really like expanding its powers, Egypt was affected as well. And so I would always hear the stories of my father, like my father's war stories, about what it was like to fight an occupier, like an invasion on your homeland.
That's crazy. I mean, I think it's interesting that for at least our generation, there's an activist take on it.
Yeah.
Whereas for our parents, it was more of them in their national identity fighting against a larger power. It wasn't as much as like an activism, like let's all be united and come. It was more like we are standing for our country and what's right. Like even in Lebanon, it was very similar, the reputation and the treatment of Palestinians in Lebanon always really confused me. And that is something that with younger generations has shifted. The older generations have this twisted perspective and maybe don't take in so much of the context of the colonizer that forcefully displaced these people into our tiny little country.
Yeah.
And so they villainize very often. I'll hear a lot of rhetoric from like 3 generations ago, 2 generations ago, of villainizing Palestinians as if it was their fault.
Yeah. I think that's a common like narrative that the generations before us have adopted about this issue. And it definitely now, I think we see it for what it was, which was like a completely manipulated narrative of how we're supposed to perceive it, and one that really favors the colonialism. Basically, it favors the oppressor. It favors us as like a lesser than region or race or like community or different countries, and it comes from that perspective. And I don't think they intentionally adopted that narrative, but I think the undoing and unlearning that we're doing now is getting us to see the history that we learned, or the stories and the stereotypes that we heard, in a totally new perspective.
But what's bringing that on though? Like, why is our generation seeing it differently?
Yeah, I think because of media and social media and the access that we have to like real on the ground stories, as opposed to whatever was packaged to us and created for us to consume previously in like decades before, when there wasn't as many people that you're seeing the true voices of people telling their stories on their own, as opposed to their stories being told about them with whatever like distorted framing and miscontextualized like history that came with that, to paint things in a way to make it like a very complex issue that people maybe don't want to get into because it's too political, when it's actually very simple at the end of the day, like you said. So I think we just have more awareness of the way we're being manipulated, basically, and wanting to free ourselves from that.
Do you think that's like a generational thing, or do you think that's unique to maybe your experience, having been a part of legacy mainstream media in your early career in journalism, being told how to maybe tell stories at the time? I know my background also, I come from a publishing family. I saw firsthand how stories were told. And I remember my dad always said, like, we're not pro-Israeli, we're not pro-Syrian, we're pro-Lebanon, but that's still a perspective, right? That's still a narrative that that company chooses to push in the content that they're telling. And realistically, like, when it came to your understanding of how stories were being told, what really made that shift for you, that made you understand that, like, objectivity isn't really a thing?
I mean, for one, like, I didn't know much about the Palestine issue when I was growing up, and that was because I grew up in the US. Like, I was born in Egypt and I was raised in the US, and so my, like, elementary, middle, and high school was very, like, American education, where you very intentionally learn nothing about this conflict, about this the occupation of Palestine. You don't even learn about it from an American perspective. Like, it's just not something you learn about. Like, there was a 6-day war at one point when all the Arabs were, like, against Israel, and then I
didn't even know you learned that.
It's very, very, very brief, as opposed to other things that are given much, much, much more weight in, like, global history. So I think coming back to the region to live here and to study and then to work, I realized that my education was very manipulated. It was left a lot out in a very intentional way. And so the lack of information came from that. And that's coming from someone that, like, the only place I would kind of hear about this is through my father's stories. So knowing that there's, like, an occupying power in the region, and it was in Egypt for a bit and now it's not, and then now it's in Palestine, kind of having a vague notion. But coming back, when I came back and started university, it was in the early 2000s. And that's when I think that was the second intifada, a huge Palestinian uprising, resistance. And it spurred a lot of protests in the Arab world, especially among students and among, like, independent, like, social and political movements. I realized then that I know nothing.
Yeah.
Even before getting into the journalism and media and stuff, like, I just, as a human who had a good education, I didn't know anything about such an important
education.
Yeah, because you're part Lebanese, so maybe it was more integrated. Was it more integrated into your life and into your, like, understanding of the global politics or regional politics?
I mean, I'm from a very politically, like, savvy family. We always talked politics. We always watched the news from when I was way too young to be consuming whatever that was on television. But in my education, which was also in France, my entire education was in France. We did not touch on that. And I went to British schools and French schools and American schools, and none of the Middle East was ever discussed, not even, like, slightly. It was really just Western history. And at least my own awareness of the concept of occupation came from the fact that Lebanon was occupied by the Syrians, right? So my first involvement in activism was in the Syria Out protests in 2004, when I was in high school and Lebanon was having this kind of resurgence of energy after the Hariri assassination to end the Syrian occupation. It never really occurred to me at the time to absorb or to process the fact that my political understanding of Lebanon expanded to other countries in the region. I was very Lebanon-centric in my education at home, as in my home education.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense given your background, Danny, but...
Yeah, I mean, that was just what our world centered on. It was a very Lebanese household. And I think, again, there was this dialogue of, like, the Palestinians in Lebanon and understanding the very unfortunate circumstances that a lot of Lebanese currently live in Lebanon, and I didn't understand why. And it was sad for me. It was confusing for me. I didn't share the perspective that a lot of people had. So it was more of a curiosity that came later.
Yeah.
And in dialogues about the region, then speaking about, occupied territories in Lebanon by Israel, I was learning a lot more about what occupation was and how it spreads and the history of it.
Being back in the region and conflict was reignited in Palestine, being closer to it made it much more real and affected our just, like, awareness of it a lot more. But we were still very much getting our information from like news organizations.
Yeah. Like what do you mean? Like newspapers?
Newspapers, legacy media, which is like large institutional newspapers that are very global. I don't know, like New York Times, Washington Post, whatever like those things are. And some of the Arab news as well, like the Egyptian newspapers, whatever. And then also a lot of television, like CNN, things like this. Until Al Jazeera was created, and it was really created to have an alternative narrative to the Western-driven narrative of what's happening in our region, regardless of where it's happening.
Yeah, I didn't even realize, but I always wondered why CNN was the TV network on my television at home my entire childhood. Like, why was it only CNN and not any other news channel? No regional news, not even Arabic news. It was just CNN, 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 and that was like another member of the freaking family.
I don't know if it was a strategy of like Arab television networks to go global, as opposed to a country like the US and its media arms, independent or not, whatever, or like falsely independent, for it to have like a global domination over any narrative and over stories that are happening all over the world, coupled with the war. America's constantly at war.
Yeah.
So it is always needs to cover the wars that it starts and engages
and own
in.
the narrative of those wars.
Right. And so unbeknownst to us, we're just kind of like, CNN is like a objective, as an example. There are many others. But
fair and balanced.
Fair and balanced. And this notion of like objectivity, that journalism is objective just because like that's the ethics of journalism. Sure. And that is the basic and like foundational ethical values of journalism and therefore media. But what does it mean to be objective? I think that's the question that a lot more people our age that are asking. Is objectivity really what's needed? What if objectivity gets you to have this kind of like whataboutism and a both sides-ism of like any conflict? Then are you really doing a service to the audience, to the readers?
Is there such a thing as objectivity though?
No,
like I don't think objectivity is a thing, because even any information is passed through a person. Any person experiences whatever they experience through their perspective. Therefore, it's subjective. End of point blank. So what are you going to write if you're being completely objective? Like, there was an explosion at this time, at this location.
I mean, you're supposed to present both sides.
Allegedly, you know.
Yes, allegedly is a very important
Okay,
word.
you present both sides, but you're like, yeah, there was a bomb in this place at this time. And then the other one's like, no, there wasn't a bomb, not at that place, not at that time, never. And so where then are you presenting?
Yeah, I think there was a notion of how to create news very quickly. There's a structure and questions that you answer, and like a flow to each news story that all people in journalism kind of learn. And that kind of doesn't leave much room, because of the fast-paced environment, it doesn't leave much room for you to like think beyond this person said this person said this is what we saw on the ground, and that's it. What's left there, the big gap, is context. My favorite word.
Context.
I love this word.
Context, guys.
I think if there's a word that appears on our like Slack channel with the team or just in conversation more than ever, it's context and nuance. And I think context is framing. It's putting history and background accurately in a way that represents the situation, not from the starting point of an issue that's convenient to you and your narrative, from the actual starting point. And that's what we saw, especially this past year with the Palestine issue, is when you're talking about what's happening and the war on Gaza, it's very convenient to start at October 7th. I think history plays a very important role in this, and the way history is written and rewritten and how you frame stories. So you start at least you give the appropriate context for this issue. So if something just happened right now and I make it seem like this is the beginning of a conflict between me and you, it's not as accurate as me telling our actual full story and saying that 2 years ago you hit me with your car, for example, and then which you did. No, she
did allegedly. Did not. Maybe. Did.
Yeah, it's different. Like it's different if you put it in that context.
Yeah,
it makes me as a reader or as an audience member understand that there's history there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just all of a sudden we woke up and this thing happened and now everything is a consequence of this one thing.
Yeah.
Like, that's very misleading. It's very intentionally misleading. And that's where the space of like independent media comes into play a lot more.
But when you're, as Amira, approaching a conflict like this within Womena, and you want to communicate it to an audience, and you want to communicate it differently than any other platform is communicating it. Because obviously, when we tell stories at Womena, we're subjective. We think women deserve equality in the world. So all of our content is going to come from our perspective of women deserve respect and equality.
Yeah.
So that's not... Like, I would say that's an objective truth, but a lot of people would disagree with me on that. So when you're coming to the table and you're confronting an issue like Palestine or the war in Gaza or the Iranian uprisings, for example, how do you do that in a way that you feel is true and also appropriate for the very short attention span and medium of the internet right now?
I think it's important to always keep asking why and when. So if something just happened, you need to ask, like, why did this happen? Okay, then why did that happen? Well, why did they do that? Why, like we have this thing that we do where we ask why at least 5 times. And that's not a journalism thing. That's just like a kind of conversation thing that you can do to dig deeper into people's stories. It's also a name of a series that we had where we asked women in specific sectors 5 whys about a certain topic. And the idea is the more you dig and the more you force this question, why, you eventually get to like the core of the problem or to the source of the problem.
But we're not creating content that explains the conflict most of the time. You're not explaining it.
I'm talking generally about like if you're trying to look into an issue and dig behind it, asking why a lot about every piece of information or knowledge that you find can lead you to a much more accurate place than whatever simplified, like current understanding of any issue there is. And you can like take that to any example, and it doesn't just have to be politics.
Okay, but how do you ask why 5 times and get to the core of it when you have a 30-second to 90-second reel that it has to fit into?
Yeah, I mean, social media is fucked.
Social media is fucked.
Even though that's where you're seeing this. Social media really, really fucked over journalism, like in a big way. And not just that, but like just the truth. Right now, we're in an era where people don't really know what is true anymore. And truth has also become very subjective, as opposed to when we grew up, there was like truths that we learned and then things happened around them or they developed in certain
But those
ways.
truths that we learned were false. So you can't say it fucked up journalism, because if you're telling me that originally even journalism pretended to be objective but actually was subjective, and it's written by history is written by the bankers and it's written by the colonialists with this agenda in mind, then if anything, I would say social media disrupted it, saved it, because now you're actually confronting the singular pathway to a narrative, and you're able to showcase the actual literal experience of people on the ground in the place that it's happening, right?
There's that's the positive side of it, but the shadow side of that is that it's very saturated, it's very, the attention spans are very limited, so you have to package content in a way that's very digestible. How we do that is when it comes to issues like Palestine, we get people that know the issue firsthand, that can speak to it firsthand, and that can give their perspective on how it's affecting them and their experience, how that's shifted, and speaking directly to that community. And we're not a news organization, and like we said, we're not out here trying to be objective. We have certain values that we uphold as a company, as individuals, as a team, and people that we feature on our platform, we hope and we seek and we do a lot of research to ensure as much as we can that they are aligned with those values, you know? And so that's how we do it. Does that pack the entire issue and get you in a 90-second clip to fully understand what's happening? No, not all the time. And we don't have any space to do that every day. But it gets you to empathize with the issue. And that's a really core element of what we do. And why we do what we do.
Because once you see that person, once you see that woman who's living that experience and you hear her talking to you in a way that gets to your heart, you have empathy, you have compassion, you recognize the humanity in others. It's so easy when you're looking at statistics and you're using terminology and we're expanding on colonialism and genocide and words like this, left, right, and center. But really, when you're getting to the heart of it, it's like people are hurting everywhere. And I'm seeing those people and I see the pain. So we talked a little bit about context, but I want to talk more about nuance because that's really like at the core of Womena's existence. At least nuance to me means a diversity of stories telling different angles of an occurrence, right? And very often the voice of women is lacking in the context of stories. We don't hear women's voices coming from them. And that is our community. That's who we want to highlight. Yeah. But also the diversity of the voices on any particular subject. So we stay on this topic. How do you approach nuance when it comes to tackling these types of crises?
Nuance is, I think, specifically in today's terms, is a bit different. And currently I see nuance as you drawing the lines between all the like intersectionality, basically, or the interconnected nature of so much of what's happening with our world. That is really giving like a fuller picture, a more nuanced picture than previous kind of diluted versions of these issues or these stories. But nuance is also drawing the intricacies of an issue, drawing the lines between, connecting the dots. It's seeing it's not just as a political issue with context, so that's kind of why it might sound similar, but also seeing it as an environmental issue, as a feminist issue. It's like beefing up the story. It's giving it more details and drawing those lines so people understand that it's not just, doesn't just exist in an abstract form on its own. There are lines that are threads that are very common between a lot of different issues we face, especially in our part of the world. And the nuance comes from telling that from our perspective, because there are cultural sensitivities, there are histories at play, there are political sensitivities, there are
gender sensitivities also.
Exactly. And without those, you don't really understand what's happening. And that's what we often hear from Western media about us.
What we hear from Western media about us?
The stories lacking all of those details that I just mentioned.
It's as if the conflict is just between Israel and Palestine. Realistically, it's not. The US is involved, the UK is involved, half of Europe is involved, Asia is involved, the rest of the Middle East is involved. The aspect of the economy is involved in it, right? There's also an aspect of like religion that's involved and ethnicity that's involved. And so I think that
yeah, I mean, if you look at like water and resources and the environment and capitalism, and if you look at all of those, then it starts to make a lot more sense why what's happening is happening. For real.
For real.
For real. And that's where, when nuance and context meet, you get a beautiful baby of like...
Called Womena.
Called Womena, but called like more accurate and more truthful storytelling and media. And that is always going to come from the people affected by the issues, much more than when someone is talking about you. Like if I'm talking about you as Elissa to someone... Sure, that's great, but that's always going to be full of my own subjectivities and ideas about who you are. But if that person gets to know you and your history and your story more fully, then they really know who you are. It's very, very similar to that. And we have to like seek it much more than we're used to. Like if you remember, your family is in publishing, you mentioned, so they had newspapers, they covered
magazines,
they covered a civil war in Lebanon, they covered so many things. And
75 years of regional history. Yeah. You saw the archives. We went to Lebanon once.
Crazy.
I mean, all of that. But that came again from the perspective of a Lebanese company that was started the year Lebanon gained its independence. So it was very Lebanon-centric and very much based on the perspectives of my grandfather, who founded that company and what he believed was
Yes.
the angle and what each journalist
Sure.
saw of it.
If you look at, masalan, how the civil war in Lebanon was portrayed by that local independent newspaper versus maybe what we would hear about it if we're outsiders and we just were hearing from like a foreign correspondent.
Yeah.
Have you ever noticed those differences?
Oh my God, absolutely. What are you talking about?
So
in
like
France, calling something Beirut was like super derogatory, right?
Yeah.
It was known as like a bombed city and devastation and like chaos, but for us it was this beautiful thing, and we have this understanding that it was had its beauty heyday in the 60s, and now when we go we see both the dark and the light and the old and the new and what
and
it
it's
could
the same
be.
with like women's issues and feminism, which is why we started Womena, because we wanted to be able to like own our own stories and own that narrative because of the way we were portrayed, and we saw ourselves being misrepresented or not represented at all in the dominant Western media. And so we started with a very clear intention of not even wanting, and this is kind of like an internal policy we have at Womena, is that we don't legitimize stereotypes about us, about women about Arab women, about women in the region, about the whole region as a whole, even men in the region, you know. We don't legitimize those stereotypes by addressing them. Like, we're not here looking at what stereotypes and we want to counter them with these stories. No, like, fuck all of that.
Yeah.
That's all not legitimate. We don't need to acknowledge it. We exist and we have our stories and our histories and our power. Regardless of what the West says or thinks about us, we don't care.
Yeah, and I think even in our community, there's differing perspectives and experiences. And that's what I also think.
But like, that's nuance.
That's nuance.
Yeah.
But we even have nuance in our own perspective that we share, because it's not our perspective as Elissa, Amira, and the team of Womena. It's our community's perspective, which is diverse in and of itself, right? So bringing to light the different individuals that you highlighted, again, on this topic of Palestine, like how many different voices are you highlighting? What was the diversity of voices, right? How did you conduct interviews? Did they self-send in videos? Like what was the approach?
This is not the first year where we shift our focus to Palestine. There's been instances over the years, like I think in 2021, and I think in 2018, there were times when there was something happening and we knew we had to acknowledge that this is happening and address it somehow. And we looked to the women in our community to do that. And the women in our community being the women, like we were saying, that are affected by it. So they're either in Palestine, they're from Palestine, they're in the Palestinian diaspora, they can speak truthfully to the experience of what they're facing and how they're feeling. And this year, starting October, like of this year, we decided to pause all our content because what was happening was more horrific than anything we've ever seen ever in our generation. And we didn't know exactly what to do, but we knew that we were definitely stood in solidarity with Palestinians, with Gaza. We knew that, like, without even discussing it really as a team, we just kind of, it goes back to like being like-minded in our values and being very transparent about what they are. So if you're not on board with this, like, bye. Like, this is not what you need. There are some things that are not up for debate. Like, are women equal? Yes, you know, like we're not going to discuss that. We can discuss other things. So we stopped all our content and then we paused for a while. We did some illustrations, some kind of things to mark what was happening and to stand in solidarity. And the longer it lasted, then we started by creating content around the issue by talking to women, like, for example, Noura Erakat, who is a Palestinian living in the US. She is a historian, she's a lawyer, she's an activist, she's a writer, she's a speaker, like she's this amazing powerhouse of women. And she speaks with such legal history and like international law knowledge that really helps you fully understand what's happening and actually simplifies it. Like, it's not that complex. It's like, this is international law. These are the violations. This is how it's being abused. And there you go. We also spoke to a Jewish American author and activist whose name is Sim Kern. And they've been creating content around this issue in solidarity with Palestine. And one of the many Jewish voices for Palestine in the West. So these are the kinds of people that we spoke to. Maryam Margouti, who is a journalist in Ramallah, and she's been a journalist for many, many years. She comes from a very political family. So these are people that really know what they're talking about,
Right.
and they can tell our audience and explain things that are happening much more than we can pretend to through like research, Google search.
Right. It's so fascinating to look at how stories can be told in different ways. And at least on my end, I'm just very proud of the approach that we take at Womena. I'm not going to take credit for how we approach it. I'm going to take credit for bringing the team together that has figured out how to approach this in a way that's incredibly necessary. The decolonization of the information that we receive is absolutely crucial. And I feel like that's what we're seeing online right now. That's what we're seeing the world shifting towards. And I want us to be at the core of that. I want us to embody it.
I think we were raised to believe and educated to believe that we live in like a post-colonial world.
Yeah,
but
and a post-feminist world.
And also, like we're done.
Yeah.
Two big issues. Now we can just like talk about climate change, which we're not even doing. But like we're not living in a post-colonial world, and we're not even living in a post-feminist world for sure. But what's happening is that we're realizing these things, and we need to like shift the understanding of certain issues that affect us so that we can see it for what it truly is. And the idea of decolonizing our minds and our stories and our narratives seeps into all areas of our life. So right now we're talking a really, really big issue, and it's horrific and it's very sad. But on the note of decolonization, like we did a documentary about the natural hair movement in the region. And a huge part of the angle that we took with that, and the reason that people were inspired to do it, is because it is a form of decolonization. Because we, like, beauty standards that were exported to us from the Western world, and we all grew up to believe that you had to be fair-skinned, straight hair, preferably blonde, preferably whatever, to be beautiful. That is a very like colonial mindset to have.
Yeah.
And so even just to feel comfortable in our own bodies as women of diverse backgrounds, of
is
like the global majority, is an act of rebellion, and it is decolonizing our lives and our image and our desires for what we want to look like and how we want to be in the world. So this idea of decolonization, it's in our storytelling, it's in our values, and it's in a lot of things we try to embody. And the women in our community, I think that's why women feel represented and really engage with our storytelling, is because, and not in like a very obvious preachy way, but this is what you see when you consume the content, and if you're aligned with it, then you're inspired by it.
That is literally like, that's what we do every single day. We showcase the humanity and the diversity of humans in order for others to recognize themselves and each other in a really profound way, so that they feel connected and they're less likely to do fucked up shit to each other. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Sage Takes Time. If you want to support us, please leave a comment, like, subscribe. It really helps us. We're an independent media company that's doing everything for you. So yeah, I hope you guys tune in next week for another episode.